This is my technique for making multiple masks at one time. I'm typically making an Aurora or Freighter style mask that has fabric ties since it is so hard to find elastic. So this is my method. I have my fabric pressed, folded. This happens to be folded right sides together. Doesn't necessarily matter. I've cleaned off my end, squared it off, and I have it lined up with the grid on my mat. The masks are 7 inches high, and I want to make sure that you can distinguish the right side from the wrong side of the mask. So I am going to cut 2 7-inch strips. I'll demonstrate in a minute. So I'm cutting 2 7-inch strips. I never rely on my math. I always measure with the ruler and then line it up because it's too easy to do the calculation wrong. So I'm going to take the strips and I'm going to lay them both right sides up, one on top of the other, so that when the mask is finished, this particular one, I'm going to do the Freighter style where it doesn't get turned inside out. Either way, if it did, you'd end up with the dots as your right side of the mask and the wrong side of the fabric indicating the wrong side of the mask. So I'm going to take this to my serger. Yes, I use my serger, and I'm going to serge both of the long ends together to hold the fabric together. I typically don't use any pins. The fabric sticks together just fine, and I'll be back in a minute. This is my method for making the pleats in the masks. I don't measure, I don't use a template that's marked, anything like that. So I have my mask piece. This is the right side, this is the wrong side. I'm going to start with the mask right side up. And it's the same basic process, but I'm going to show you different how to eliminate some of the steps. So fold in half, give it a quick press so you get that center crease. That's important. Fold the bottom up to the center. Fold the top down to the center. Press both of those creases. You could press the whole thing, but you want to make sure that you don't press out that middle crease that you made first. Okay, now you're going to take it and flip it over and make your first pleat. This is the bottom of the mask. You're going to check, kind of eyeball it. That's roughly about 1/2 inch. Now you could, I'll show you this, iron that pleat to set it in place. Now fold it back on that pleat, pinch this, fold this back so that these edges line up. And if you want, you can give it another press. Last step, and as you can see, you now have roughly 2 1/2-inch pleats butted up against each other. The last step is to take the top and fold it up, and on the end you kind of eyeball to make sure that you have another pleat that's about the same size as the first two, and you give it a final press. I don't use any pins or any clips to hold it at this point. The pressing is enough to hold it. I'm going to show you a couple of other options, and then I'll be going to the serger and again using that narrow seam, putting them all together and serging down the edge. So let me show you a couple of other quicker techniques. Same folding technique, you can eliminate some of the pressing steps. Every time you move to pick up the iron, it's motion that adds time to the process. And if you can take some of those movements out, your process will be a little bit quicker. So you can again, I press the middle fold, I press the top and bottom. You can now, I can't get my head over there to see. You can press this one. Instead of pressing, you can fold it down, fold it back, fold it back, give it a press. This is the technique, the one I just showed you, that I use most often. If you want to eliminate yet one more lift of the iron, you make a little, you can mark that. The two most, and I'm going to flip it over, the two most important pleats or creases are the center one and that one. So now what you can do is flip this over. So I'm over at the serger. I've got my 5 mask pieces. I'm going to send them through the serger all in the same direction. So I'm going to start here. When I get to the end, before I get to the very end, I stop so that I keep these butted up against each other. And as you can see, I'm not using any pins. The ironing has kept them nice and flat, and I'm just using my hand to hold everything flat as it feeds through the serger. Now I'm going to turn everything around and go back the other direction. And there we go. We have all 5 pieces all strung together as close as possible. And the next step will be to bind these edges using my binding attachment on my machine, which I will show you next. This is the technique I use to cut the strips of fabric that are used to bind the sides and the edges of this style of mask. I'm going to start by laying my fabric out on my gridded mat. I've already trimmed off this edge so it's nice and straight. I have my fabric folded right sides together. I'm going to make a mark over here along the folded edge. So when I'm feeding the strips of fabric through my binding attachment, I know where to insert the edge of the mask. If you were doing this without the binder, you would take the center fold and line it up with the center of the mask. But because this end will meet the binder first, I need to have a marking on the fabric so I know where to insert it. So roughly, I'm going to mark from the fold. If the fold would normally be, you can see how the tie extends here. So if the fold would normally be here, I'm going to need to make a mark approximately here. These happen to be roughly 9-inch masks, and so I'm going to mark at 4.5. And this mark will be used, like I said, so I know where to insert the mask. I'm going to be making 5 masks at a time. I need 2 strips of fabric per mask. I have a 28mm binder, which results in a folded strip of about 1/4 inch. And so my strips are 1 inch wide, and so for 5 masks I will need 10 strips. And to bind the edges, I know that I can get all 5 masks on 1 strip, so that will be 1 extra strip when I cut them. So I'm going to make a mark on my fabric. I'm just using a colored pencil, and I'm marking 10 inches because I'm going to cut 10 strips, and I will end up cutting an extra one for binding. Might be a little bit difficult to see with this striped fabric, but I'll be able to see it when I'm sending it through the binder. Now to make this a little easier, I'm going to fold this over. I'm going to line up my cut edges there. I'm going to realign it on my gridded mat so that everything lines up with the grid marks. When I'm cutting, I'm using the grid marks and not the edge of the fabric. Here's my other trick for being efficient. This is a ruler that has slots for your rotary cutter, and this is a June Taylor one. I happened to win this in a package of June Taylor supplies. I know on Amazon, for example, I think there's another brand called Stripology that makes rulers like this. They're not cheap. Really, any plexiglass rulers really aren't cheap, but it does make it much more efficient to do multiple 1-inch cuts. This one happens to have slots at every 1/2 inch. So if you were cutting your strips to do it manually or 1.5 inches, something like this could be used as well. So I'm going to lay this on here, and I'm lining it up with my grid lines. I'll grab my cutter. I'm going to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 cuts. I need 4 more. One, 2, 3, 4. There we go. Next, I'll show you how I string these together so I can send them all through the binder in one pass without stopping and starting for each one. Here are my 10 strips of fabric that I will use to bind 5 masks. I've laid them out just like I had cut them. If I take the fold and pull it back, here is the mark that I made so that I know where to feed in the mask when I send it through the binder. They're all laying the same way. I've put 5 on one side, 5 on the other. The first thing I'm going to do is take the strip that will actually be the starting point that will start feeding through the binder. And on the side where I made the marking, that end of the strip, and I forgot to mention that I cut my strips selvage to selvage, so the selvage end is already finished, and I don't need to turn under the end. But I am going to take this to the iron, and I'm going to get the fold started. I'm going to fold it in twice and give it a good press. Okay, I've got a good fold and crease on the end of this strip. That will help when I start it into the binder. It'll help it stay folded. The next thing you're going to need, or that I use, is Wash Away Wonder Tape. This tape is great. It's double-sided and it dissolves with water. And I'm going to use this to butt the ends of these strips together and hold them together in a single layer so that they smoothly feed through the binder. And I have 10 strips, so I need 9 inches of tape, 1 inch less than the number of strips that you have. I'm going to pull the paper off so it's stuck down to the table on one side of the sticky. I'm going to cut these at the 1 inch marks because my strips are 1 inch wide, or 1 inch wide. And this will just make it easier so I don't have to cut it after I connect them. I'm going to take, this is my starting strip, the fold is on one end. I'm going to take the other end and I'm going to lay it approximately halfway down the middle of the strip. I'm going to take the other end, and I want to start with the side that has the marking on it because that will be the first side when it starts this new strip to feed in. I'm going to butt that end up and take the other end and put it down on the next row. I'll come back over here. This is going to feed this way. I'll take this strip, butt it next to that one, put the next one on the row below. So I'm going to continue this and then I'll show you the next step. Okay, my last strip is over here on this side and its other end doesn't get connected to anything. I'm going to give this a good press to make sure those are adhered. I'm going to take my rotary cutter. Oh, don't need to do that. I already cut them ahead of time. Now I'm going to gently lift all of these up. And the last step is if I were to feed this through the binder like this other side of this tape is still sticky. And that will undoubtedly catch on the binder and this would get all kind of bunched up in there. So I'm going to use a simple household item. I have some cornstarch here. I'm using a little sponge brush as my applicator. You could use your finger as well. It tends to get either too much or too little. I found the brush does a good job, and you're just going to dab enough on there and rub it until it feels smooth and not sticky. So I'm going to do each of the connecting sections. Apply cornstarch to each of the connecting sections. Make sure I didn't miss one. And to the beginning, And now I have one very long strip of binding that is ready to send through my binding attachment on my machine, and that's what I'll show you next. I have my 5 pieces all strung together, the edges with the serger, and now I'm going to bind the edges. I'm using a Baby Lock cover stitch machine. I realize everybody does not have one of these, but several people have asked me about how I use it, and so I wanted to start by giving that demo. I will show later how I use a binder attachment for my regular sewing machine. I'm using a 28mm generic binder that said it was compatible with Baby Lock machines. I just purchased this less than 2 weeks ago on Amazon for approximately $45, I think, which is a pretty good deal given that the brand name ones are more expensive than that. So that takes roughly a 1-inch piece of fabric, woven fabric. So I'm going to start, and I have I'm using a single needle chain stitch, and I have this set up using my center needle just because that's where I wanted to position and easily be able to see my fabric coming through. I'm going to start with, bear with me here, I'm going to start with a scrap of fabric so that I can stitch off the end of it. To prepare my binding strip, my 1-inch selvage piece, I did take it to the iron, and to get it started I pressed it in half, pressed the edges in, and then pressed the fold, giving it a good crease, just like you would if you were preparing all the full strips by hand. Now I'm going to use a pin, going to feed it into my binder. Get it positioned on the end here. I use my pin to pull it up to the needle. I get the needle in it, put the foot back down, take a couple of stitches. I usually try to stop with the needle down. So I've got my strip over here. And because I've got these all strung together, it's going to help pull them through the machine. So I get the first one kind of started, and then they will all just kind of get sucked into the fabric binding strip and pull through. So I'm using this hand just to make sure the fabric feeds in straight. Sometimes you can get a kink and then it would feed in that way. I don't want that to happen. And over here I'm just making sure that my edge of my mask stays up against the edge of the plate. And you can see as that one comes up, it's going to help pull it through. Now before I get to the end here, because I want to maximize my fabric, I only want to use one strip, I need to come around here, and I'm cutting off that one so that I can flip them around, and now you can see this side is done. Now I need to do this other side. So as this one finishes feeding through, I'm going to butt this one up next to it. Okay, now remember, I don't have the end finished on that one there. This, I have just enough fabric to finish that last one. I know you may not be able to see it, it's off camera. So I'm going to cut between these two. And now I have the binding on all of the edges of my Freighter style masks. We're almost ready to bind the long edges of the masks. Before we do that, we do need to separate them. So I have taken the strung together masks to the iron and given the edges a good press to make sure I get them as flat as possible. Having these edges as flat as possible with all those layers will make it go through the binding attachment easier. Now I'm going to come in with my rotary cutter and cut these apart. Ideally, I got them butted right up next to each other, and with a single cut I can cut them apart. Here it's a little wider and I don't want that little tail, so I trim off that little tail because that will add more bulk going through the binding attachment. And one more. There we go. 5 masks ready to put the binding strips on the long edges. Here we are ready to put the binding strips on our 5 masks. So I'm going to start again. Feed the scrap fabric through. I've, remember, started by creasing the beginning of my binding strip. Going to get it positioned, put the needle into the beginning of the strip, press our foot down, and now I'm going to let the machine do all the work. I'm going to watch for this mark coming up, which is where I want to start the insertion of the edge of my mask. And remember, we measured from the center of the strip, so that will roughly end up then positioned, centered on the mask. I have all my masks positioned next to my machine so I can grab them quickly. I have them all facing the same direction. So let's get started. Now, this mark has just approached. It's at the edge of the binder. I'm going to watch as it comes through, and I have to get my head down here to see where it is. It's now positioned about right here. The more you practice this, you can begin to eyeball it and feed this through as the line comes up. And you see the strip kind of catches the mask and pulls it in. So with one hand I'm going to keep the strip out here straight, and with the other hand I'm going to make sure that the edge of my mask is butted up against my binder. As it comes to the end, again I'm letting the binder do all the work, and now I'm just going to run the strip through. I'm going to continue applying binding to the edges of the masks, and I'll show you what to do when we get to the end. come to the end of my strip, so when it gets to the end here, I'm just going to let it go and it will slowly feed in, and I'll let it chain off the end. Just a couple of quick steps left. So I've gathered up all of the ties at the point where the ties were butted against each other, so where we butted those selvage edges together. And I'm going to take this to my sewing machine now, the only time I'll be using my sewing machine, and I'm going to use a very tiny stitch. I use the length of about 1.2, and I'm going to stitch twice across the end of each side here, and here. And then I'll come back to the table and I'm going to use my rotary cutter to cut right down the middle to separate those ties. Here's what it looks like after I've done all of that stitching across each end of the tie. Might be hard to see. There is a tiny row of stitching here. There is a tiny row of stitching here. You'll notice once again I've chained everything together. Every time you stop and start your thread and have to trim tails, that takes extra time. So now I'm going to come in. I'm going to use my rotary cutter because it just nestles down in there. I'm going to cut each of these apart. And now I'm going to come in and find the spot where the ties butted up together, and I'm just going to use my rotary cutter to separate the two. And because that selvage is such a tight weave, even if you end up cutting some of the threads, it's not going to ravel easily. And there you have it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 masks completed in a batch.